writes for TV and several novels. One that will be focusing in on a love affair between a Jewish woman and a Muslim man that created great controversy in Israel. So, in sum, 9 o'clock this week. We're going to move the time next week, and I'm still debating whether it'll be 9:30 or 10 o'clock going forward. And you're the core students. We have many others who've come in and out that I look to have come in and out. But please text me or write me or chat me and let me know 9:30 or 10 as I weigh the alternatives. Today,
Rabbi,
yes,
would
Lindy.
you start, because a lot of Ari's classes start at, it seems, 10.
Yeah, normally he just does 12:30s. It's just this week
Oh, okay.
and last week
All
that
right.
he's doing it that way. All right, so I'll be weighing the two. So this week, we're doing Psalms 54, 55, and 56. I've prepared all of them, and in particular, on Thursday, I'll be doing a little talk on tear jars and perfume jars, which, according to the Wikipedia on tear jars, emerges from Psalm 56. So at least there's something different and that I'm fascinated by. Today, by way of introduction, Psalm 54 feels remarkably familiar. I'm going to read it. And today, what I want to talk about is the topic of attribution. Are these written by David or not? I want to give some of the historical context in this case, for it is attributed to David, and then a distinctive closing line, which is what I chose as a phrase for the title, "Upon my enemies my eye has stared." Psalm 54. So let me first read the psalm, then go back through it with some commentary, particularly the story of the Zivites and Saul. For the conductor of string music,
Rabbi, do you want to put it up on the screen?
Oh, thank you, Mimi. See, that's why I'm so glad you're back to remind me of these basic things. You know what I need to do is I first need to, one second. Okay. Almost there. All right. Now, one second. Here we go. Psalm 54. For the conductor of string music, a maskil of David. When the Zivites came and said to Saul, "Is David not hiding out among us?" God, by your name deliver me, and by your might vindicate me. God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the utterances of my mouth. For strangers have risen up against me, and the ruthless have sought my spirit. They did not set God before them. Selah. Behold, God is my helper, my supreme one, who is with upholders of my spirit. May God return the evil to my watchful foes. With your truth, demolish them. With a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will acclaim your name, Adonai, for it is good. For from every strait God has saved me, and upon my enemies my eye has stared. It's a short psalm. It's a petitionary psalm that moves toward trust and then thanksgiving. It's a psalm that's spoken directly to God. The name God, Elohim, is repeated 4 times, Yud-He, Vav-He once, Adonai once, but there's a lot of by your name. You have been my help. There's a sense of a direct address to God for really all but the last line, which shifts to the third person. We've seen this word maskil in a number of the recent Psalms. And again, a maskil, at least as it's commonly understood, means a teaching. And here is the situation of King David, identified in the 2nd verse. It's another one of those stories of David on the run from King Saul. The first book of Samuel, chapter 23, this incident is verses 14 to 28. Here's the story. Ziv is part of the tribe of Judah. It's David's tribe. In that sense, David is hiding from Saul, who seeks to kill him. He seeks to kill him, as said earlier in the book of Samuel, because after Goliath, he, David, achieved great notoriety as a courageous young man willing to take on the Philistines. And people began to sing songs in honor of David. And Saul, who enters into a phase of his life of great emotional instability, particularly after he failed to kill all the Amalekites, the prophet Samuel, who had appointed Saul, the king of Israel, said that by Saul having saved the king of the Amalekites, kind of a professional courtesy, instead of killing him, he had betrayed God's instructions. And at least as it's recorded in the book of Samuel, from that point on, Saul becomes very emotionally unstable. That's where David's brought in as a young player of the lyre, the harp, to comfort him so he can sleep at night. And then after Goliath, when David goes on to achieve this notoriety, Saul fears that David will try and supplant him. And we'll see this more in the psalm, I think it's tomorrow, of Jonathan being a source of protection. No, it's actually today. I'll read the verse in a moment. Who's David's best friend will say in verse 17 of chapter 23, first book of Samuel, Jonathan will say to David, "Do not be afraid. The hand of my father Saul will never touch you. You are going to be king over Israel, and I shall be second to you. And even my father Saul knows this is so." Unquote. And so David is on the run, hiding from Saul. He goes to what should be a safer area, Chorish, in the wilderness of Ziv, when the people of the area, the Zivites, go to Saul and they say to him, quote, "David is hiding among us in the strongholds of Chorish at the hill of Chalilah, south of Jeshimon. So if your majesty has the desire to come down, and it will be our task to deliver him into your majesty's hands." And so part of the trauma for David in this account is that it's his own kinsfolk, his extended clan, who go to Saul and say, "We know that you want to find David. He's hiding among us." That's the setting. And that raises the question, and what will happen, by the way, I shared this in my introduction for today, is that Saul himself joins the troops to go find David and his men. They have them encircled on a hill when a messenger comes and says to Saul, the Philistines have attacked. We bring your forces now. And the siege around David is called off. He is, if in that regard, miraculously saved. He will flee to En-Gedi. And in chapter 24, David will have an encounter with Saul. But I won't get ahead. Take a look. It's dramatic, where they will be in the same cave together. And later, David will say to Saul, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Why are you seeking to kill me? But focusing on this moment, we don't know if verse 2, when the Zivites came and said to Saul, is David not hiding out among us? If this is the moment when David wrote this prayer, if David wrote this prayer afterwards, recounting the miracle-like escape in that he was surrounded by Saul and his troops, and if not for the attack by the Philistines was a goner, or whether this moment that was widely known of David's salvation was used as a motif, an archetype, at a later point for someone who also felt saved and linked their own transition from danger to safety, as it was just like when David was pursued, and more than pursued, when the Ziv people, his kinsmen, had turned on him. And so this is the motif here in a shorter psalm that has now become very familiar to us, namely moments in David's life in which he is pursued by enemies, and in some cases, enemies like his kinsmen, but even more, Saul himself. For Saul and David had a bond. I read that quote from Jonathan, David's best friend. Jonathan, who says, I'll be number 2 to you. I will even risk my life to protect you. And in that regard, David, as you'll see in chapter 24, the way he speaks to Saul, feels very close to the king, beholden to the king, respectful of the king, and his being pursued by somebody that he trusted and wanted to be trusted by gives context to what is a common theme throughout the Psalms, which is betrayal by someone you wanted to trust and be trusted by, who becomes an enemy. In terms of historicity, we do know from the book of Samuel that David did write psalms, songs to God, poems of personal attachment to God. That gives context for where the book of Psalms, almost half, are attributed to David. But we don't know, again, if he necessarily wrote the words himself. And in some degree, it really doesn't matter. For ultimately, and even in our study today, the question is, how are these words our words? How are these longings to God worthy of being repeated by us as if they were our song, a song that we feel expresses our needs? And so let me walk through it a little bit, and I'll leave time for some reactions. Verse 3 and 4 are a petition. God, by your name, deliver me, and by your might vindicate me. God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the utterances of my mouth. And that'll also be the inclusio, the envelope, namely, God, by your name, you see in verse 3, and then you get it in verse 8. And 8 and 9 go together. I will acclaim your name, Adonai. So a word about God's name. To refer to God by your name, today people, instead of using God's name, will say like Baruch Hashem. Orthodox people will say Baruch Hashem, which means blessed is the name. So the name becomes one step removed from using God's intimate name, Yud He Vav He. By referring to God's name, it's a way of suggesting God's mystery and power. Every name in the Bible, names in the Bible, are signifiers of person and power. By the way, the name David means beloved one, beloved to God. And in some sense, as the author of Psalms, he, as the lover, the beloved one, is central to David's identity. And so back to the psalm here, verses 3 and 4, that's the petition. And essentially, the petition is, deliver me and listen to my prayer. And then verse 5 gives the context for this petition, the lament. For strangers have risen up against me, and the ruthless have sought my spirit. They did not set God before them. Now, this creates a tension because he calls his pursuers strangers. And for King David, the Zivites are clansmen, and Saul knows him well. So it can either be metaphorical, they are acting toward me like a stranger. That's possible in poetry. Those who read it more directly would say calling them strangers means that it wasn't written by David. For me, it's a question mark. It can be either way. But what is true is that David feels that those who pursue him, this reoccurring theme, are seeking to kill him. So they have sought my spirit. Nafshi, spirit is also life. They have sought my life. They seek to kill me. And that's because, again, a reoccurring theme, they did not set God before them, meaning they are not seeking justice. And now he expresses the contrast, how he, David, sets God before himself, how God is worthy of his trust. Hine Elohim ozer li. Behold, God is my helper. Adonai. Adonai means my master, which I'm choosing these days to translate as my supreme one, who is with upholders of my spirit. And here there's ambiguity, which I shared in my introductory letter, in that it can either be translated my supreme one who upholds my spirit, so it's God who upholds my spirit, or it is God who is with the upholders of my spirit, of my life. God is with those who are with me. And David wasn't alone. David had soldiers with him. David was precisely pursued because he was popular with the people. In that regard, it might be a suggestion that God is with the people who think David is good. That quality of ambiguity can also be purposeful, where both can be true. God can, because of the ambiguity embedded in the Hebrew, God can both be with David and with the people that support David. And back to the petition, may God return the evil to my watchful foes. With your truth, demolish them. Again, the truth of right and wrong, how I have no evil in regard to Saul. I am not seeking to hurt Saul in any way. And those who claim that I am a threat to his authority, they are lying. They are untruthful. They deny God. And then the punchline of Thanksgiving, 8 and 9, with a free will offering, nidava, ezbacha, I will sacrifice lach to you. I will acclaim your name, Adonai, ki tov, for it is good. And the last line, which is the one which shifts to the third person, ki makol tzara hatzilani, for from every tsuris, from every strait, God has saved me. Uva ovai, and upon my enemies, ra'ata eini, my eye has stared. Now, interestingly, it's not in the plural, it's only an eye, and ra'ata means seen. So my eye sees my enemy, one eye. Now, these are closing thoughts. I like this image of, I take the word stare from another translation, and I liked it because it's in Hebrew, there isn't a word stare. So a word like ra'ata, look, in English, the word look has a variety of choices that are more limited in Hebrew. That's what allows for ambiguity in Hebrew, because it's a more limited vocabulary, more than one possible meaning. But I like the image of stare, because here the concluding words are to say, I have seen, others translate it as, I have looked in the eye of my enemy. That's how ArtScroll translates it, which is to either say, I have seen danger up close. That's one facet of my eye has stared. The other possibility is, even though I have seen it up close, in light of what came before, I was not afraid because I trusted in your justice, that you would protect me. At the same time, and this is just me and I haven't seen this, that perhaps it's in the singular to say, I've kept one eye on my enemy, and I've always kept one eye on other needs of how to deal, even to escape. Because here, in fact, he will escape. It's not after the story of Samuel. It's not like once the troops leave, David says, okay, God's my shield. I don't need to do anything. He runs to En-Gedi to hide in a cave, which is to say, one eye is on the enemy and one eye is looking to be safe. There's this image in the Talmud. There's a phrase, al tismoch benes, do not rely on a miracle. The rabbis will even say, and I shared this earlier in our Psalm study, if somebody announces that the Messiah has come and you're planting a tree, keep planting the tree before you go to check it out, which is to say, start from the place of being grounded in normalcy, in needing to take care of yourself. Al tismoch benes. Don't anticipate, don't rely on a miracle. And so here, there is an ode of the psalmist thanking God for deliverance, expressing trust in God, and this closing image, upon my enemies my eye has stared. I have seen my enemy up close. I've done it calmly because I trust in you, and yet my other eye is also open to the needs and realities of the moment. So I pull this back toward closure, and that's to say, I am aware that the themes of this psalm seem already quite familiar. And in that regard, why do we need another psalm to say it? In what sense is this worthy of being our song So a few thoughts in that regard. One, I am reminded that my life is far less dramatic than David's. Nobody has pursued me, to my knowledge, to kill me, let alone somebody who was as if a godfather to me, who I felt so close to, whose son was my best friend. I mean, this, not unlike the Bathsheba story we did last week of David with adultery and murder as an older man, here as a younger man, this quality of trauma is far greater in terms of a pursuit by an enemy than anything I know. But the motif of Psalms and the motif of this psalm is that there is danger in all our lives. And it's precisely danger, whether it be COVID, whether it be other aspects of the world around us, are where our energy goes. We invest our energy as the smoke is around me and around us, as Mimi has had to leave her place to be with Carol, to be at a safe distance from home. When there is danger, that rivets our attention, and rightly so. We are both wired to survive, we're wired to be on guard against danger, and in prayer, we naturally seek to address the challenge of danger, to say we trust in God, that we know that God has been there for us as a source of help, of an upholder of both our spirit and the people around us. But again, what I'm struck by is the closing image for what makes this psalm a different way of expressing a familiar theme. Upon my enemies, my eye has stared. I see the dangers around me, but I don't overreact. I am aware in a trusting way that things will get better, and yet I must respond responsibly and not depend on miracles for change in the world around me, so as to have a world that's a world that is more safe and good. So with that, reactions to Psalm 54 and your thoughts. I'm going to close off the share so that I have the privilege of seeing us. Viviana, good to see you this morning. Nice to see. And Vivian next to you on my screen. A Vivian and a Viviana. And Bob, it's nice to have Bob back from our break. And
I have to say something.
go ahead, Viviana. Go ahead.
I am in Buenos Aires.
Wonderful.
So you are international.
We went with Lindy, we went from coast to coast, and with Viviana, we went to,
North and South.
Continent. Well, wonderful to have you.
Thank you. I am here taking care of my dad's apartment and stuff. So
well, I wish you well. Let's talk at the end of the class. Stay on and let's catch up for a moment.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Great to see you.
Thanks.
Psalm 54. Richard, go ahead.
Well, if no one else has anything to say here, verses 3, 4, 6, 8, and 9. I can own those. I can resonate with those. Verse 7 though is a dissonance to me, and the idea comes up repeatedly in the Psalms. It says, "May God return evil to my watchful foes, and with your truth demolish them."
Yeah.
On a personal basis, not to detract any way with the psalm itself, but I would probably just say, let it go to enemies. If I had to reword that slightly, it says, with your truth, bring them along, enlighten them. something of that nature. I don't, because someone is an enemy doesn't necessarily mean I want their destruction.
So
Even if
there-
they might want mine. I don't want to go there. You know, I don't want to take
Yeah.
that position. It would be Hashem's, what would you call it? His decision to do that. I'm not sure I would want to try to say, this is what I want you to do. Anyway, go ahead.
No, that you put your finger on a really important verse in terms of a key idea. And that is, I'll reframe what I heard you sharing, Richard, and that is there's a quality of judgment by David with a verdict. And the verdict is destroy my enemy. And Richard says that's really troubling. It should be left to the judge, to God to decide, one. And two, shouldn't the prayer be destroy their evil ways rather than destroy them? There is that very story, by the way, in the Talmud. There's a Rabbi Meir, and he prays for the destruction of his enemies. And his wife, Bruria, who is the wise wife in the Talmud, she will say, Rabbi Meir, my husband, you did not speak well in your prayer. You need to reformulate it. You need to say, may their deeds, may their ways be changed to no longer be evil rather than to destroy them. And in that case, Rabbi Meir changes his prayer. So know that that tension is there, and it's one of those examples. It's a longer story about who Bruria is, the wise wife, but that's one of the stories. And yet, you know, this came up, I think even last week in the psalm we looked at, and that is, do David clearly, as here, prays for the destruction of his evil foes? And the question that Rabbi Cohen had asked is it appropriate to ask for evil people to be punished? You know, and no more needs to be said other than that there is a tension around this theme. And what is clear is that at least in Psalms, there is, as here, David praying for the destruction of a foe. One more reaction, Viviana?
Yeah,
I was going to say that I found the last verse very interesting, and I'm sorry I missed the first 15 minutes, but I have people working here. The fact that I keep one eye on my enemies and the other, you know, my other eye is taking care of everything else. And I kind of think it's a little like what you were saying, that don't expect miracles, pay attention.
Yeah.
So I see those two, you know, the thing that you talked about paying attention to what's going on, don't drop everything and go expect the Messiah, but, you know, don't disregard that the Messiah could be coming. Get down your stuff and go look at it. So,
you know, this also raises one other question that you elicit for me, Viviana, and that's the nature of prayer. And that is, you know, may my foes be defeated, may they be destroyed, is what one wishes for. And it's understandably when somebody's trying to kill you, the context, you say, you know, kill them. But is that what you would ultimately want to say the next day? So we'll leave it at that. Hal had his hand up. Hal, last comment for today, and then I'll pull it together. Oh, Marvin. Hal, and then Marvin, and I'll pull it together.
Okay. So the last line in your translation, the eye stares, and that really leaves open an interpretation of what that means. In the King James Version, the last line is, my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies, which is more descriptive, and it closes off any possibility of mysterious meaning of the stare.
Yeah. So two things in that regard, Hal. In the context I could see why they added the word triumph of my enemies, but it's not in the Hebrew. So the Hebrew is this, I try to translate more literally, for from every trouble, God, he has saved me, and on my enemies saw my eye. So the King James Version is filling in the blanks
Right.
to give it context. And that's fine to do, but it's another example of translations are interpretation.
Right.
And I've chosen, rather than pulling it together neatly,
Right.
to leave a tension.
That's better.
Yeah. Marvin, last comment. So as to pull this together, you have to unmute Marvin. Thank you, Hal. Go ahead, Marvin. You're still muted. Marvin, you're still muted. Hit your,
Okay.
there you go.
The same
ahead.
verse that Richard mentioned, there's a change there. Verse 6, it says, "See God." He's speaking to somebody else. Then he says, "The Lord is my support." So he's speaking to another, or the group. And then he says, "He will repay." But then it switches to talking about God, and it says, "Your faithfulness." So in the same verse, it is strange. Is your translation of that word faithfulness the same as I'm reading in the JPS here?
Which verse are you on?
7.
So, okay, read me the JPS for 7.
It says, he will repay the evil of my watchful foes. By your faithfulness, destroy them.
So the words in Hebrew,
Faithfulness is the word I'd like to define. Is there a
So-
better one?
the word in Hebrew is emet. Emet literally is truth, but your truthfulness has also been interpreted, can be interpreted as your faithfulness. So what does it mean, God's truth? God's faithfulness, which is only to say it's one step removed from the literal, and Hatzmitem is will demolish them.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Thank
let me pull this together. I'm always, when we go over the 9:30, I'm always aware that people have things to do. I want to say that tomorrow there's another, it's a fairly similar kind of psalm, but it's, in this case, David's most trusted advisor named Achitophel has turned on David and aligned with David's son, Absalom, in rebellion against David. So later, it's the other phase of David's life, the end of David's life, but similar, being betrayed by somebody David trusted. So there's that same element. And there's also a wonderful image. Had I wings like a dove, David says, as if to fly away from his troubles. And we'll spend more time talking about that image of why a dove and why and where he wanted to fly to. But a similar motif, but remarkably, at the end of his life, today we saw a younger David being pursued by Saul in its context, or anybody being pursued by somebody you would have seen as an ally, and one eye stares or looks at that enemy, and perhaps the other is watchful. A closing of Kaddish. For anybody who would join with me honoring a loved one today, I invite you to do so as I enlarge the Kaddish. And we answer Amen to multiplied blessing. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Hashem Rabbah
Amen.
Bi'alma divra kirute, bi'amlich malchute, b'chayechon u'byomechon uvchaye d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevarach, le'olam olmei olmaya.
Amen.
Yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shemei d'kudsha b'richu. La min kol birachata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran v'alma v'imramei,
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen.
Amen.
Thank you for helping me start the day in learning. At 10 o'clock, I'll be part of introducing Dorit Rabinyan. That's the OCCSB speaker. She had the #1 selling novel in Israel for 1 year, few years ago, due to a controversy whether it could be taught in high schools about a love relationship between a Jewish woman and a Muslim man. She's, as I mentioned, a TV writer, a poet, 3 novels of Iranian descent. If any of you are watching Tehran, the Amazon series, I do recommend it. Exceedingly well done. Written by the same fellow who wrote Fauda. Bottom line, a lot of it is about Iranian daughters. So I will look to ask her about being an Iranian daughter. Thank you. I look to see you tomorrow. Psalm 55. 9 o'clock, had I wings like a dove. Be well. Viviana, stay on for a moment to say hi.
Yes. Yes.
Be well.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Nice
you.
seeing
Thank you.
Thank you,
you.
Rabbi.